Good afternoon, all participants. My name is Kianda Dipatya Shahindra. I am from the ASEAN Center for Energy, and I will be the MC for today's webinar. I would like to welcome you all to our webinar today on the role of industry in buildings policy development. This webinar is part of a collaborative project under the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Subsector Network and is jointly organized by the ASEAN Center for Energy, the ASEAN Secretariat, and the International Energy Agency, with support from the ASEAN-Australia Development Cooperation Program Phase 2. Without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Gerald Pasqua from the ASEAN Secretariat to deliver the webinar's welcoming remarks.
Thank
Next
you,
slide,
Kanda.
please. And Mr. Gerald Pasqua, the time is yours.
Yes, thank you, Gianda, and good afternoon, everyone, distinguished delegates and participants. The ASEAN Secretariat, together with the International Energy Agency and the ASEAN Center for Energy, are all honored to welcome you all in this ASEAN-IEA webinar on the role of industry in buildings policy development. We also wish to thank the support given by the ASEAN-Australia Development Cooperation Program Phase 2 for this undertaking. Last but not least, our appreciation also goes to the moderator and the panelists who will be sharing their knowledge and expertise in today's virtual event. To sustain the progress of the ASEAN economic community, ASEAN continues to work in achieving its energy security, accessibility, affordability, and sustainability goals amidst the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic and global climate action. To this end, the recently adopted ASEAN Plan of Action on Energy Cooperation, or APAEC Phase 2, 2021 to 2025, articulates ASEAN's aim to accelerate energy transition and to strengthen energy resilience in the region. One important aspect of this strategy is the adoption of energy efficiency measures that reduce energy use and emissions in cost-effective ways while increasing energy security and overall economic productivity. Under the APAEC Phase 2, ASEAN is collectively set to reduce energy intensity by 32% in 2025 based on 2005 levels, and to encourage further energy efficiency and conservation efforts, especially in transport and industry sectors. ASEAN has developed minimum energy performance standards, for example, for air conditioners and lighting products, and launched its first cross-sectoral initiative in energy efficiency performance testing for ACs. This will help pave way for the adoption of other higher efficiency and climate-friendly appliances such as lighting and air cooling systems. Ongoing work is also being done with the IEA to develop ASEAN roadmaps on energy efficient buildings and construction, which is the subject of today's webinar, and sustainable cooling to provide policy recommendations as a pathway to efficient, resilient, and low emission buildings. Through this webinar, we look forward to engaging with relevant stakeholders, most especially the industry and business sectors, to share innovative practices and to explore new business models with a view of improving the energy performance of buildings across ASEAN. With that, thank you very much. Kianda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gerald Pasqua, for the welcoming remarks. Before we proceed to the core of this webinar, allow me to highlight the overall agenda of today's webinar. Next, please. The welcoming remarks was delivered by the ASEAN Secretariat and followed by the introduction and the webinar orientation. After that, we will have a panelist session led by Dr. Ian Hamilton, professor from the UCL Energy Institute and the International Energy Agency. Our panelist members include Mr. Sultan Sahara from the Ministry of Public Works and Public Housing of Indonesia, Mr. Zulkifli Zahari, President of the Malaysia Association of Energy Services Companies, Mr. Matthew Kail, Consultant in Energy Efficiency and Low Carbon Development of Green Building SAS, or the Global Buildings Performance Network, and Mr. Christopher Seeley, Energy Efficiency and Climate Change Expert and CEO of Climate Change Solutions, an ESCO in Thailand. The moderator will introduce the speakers and call on each speaker to deliver their presentation. Each speaker will deliver a 15-minute presentation, and after each presentation, a brief discussion will follow. The moderator may come back to the speaker and ask 1 to 2 questions and pick up some questions from the audience, from the chat box, and also the registration form. For the panelists, we would like to appreciate if the presentations are kept within the allocated time. At the end of the webinar, the ASEAN Secretariat will be delivering the closing remarks. And last but not least, the ASEAN Center for Energy will inform you of a survey that you can fill up to help the buildings and cooling roadmaps development process. And that's the overall agenda for your reference. Next slide, please. Now allow me to kindly inform you of some basic rules for today's webinar to ensure this webinar runs smoothly. Firstly, participants should ensure a convenient environment and reduce background noises. Secondly, participants should mute their microphones and keep their video cameras turned off so that the webinar can run smoothly without interruptions. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to ACE's YouTube channel, so we kindly ask for your consent in doing so. And for the Q&A session, we invite all attendees to participate in this interactive discussion by asking questions using the chat function in the control panel, and the moderator will help you in conveying it to the relevant panelist. And before moving to the panel session, I would like to invite all speakers and moderator to please turn on your cameras for a group photo session, please, everyone. Okay, I will take the picture in 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much. Now, I kindly invite Dr. Ian Hamilton to lead today's presentation and Q&A sessions. Dr. Hamilton, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kenda, and also to Gerald for your introduction to the session. It was very pleasure to be here and to share this panel with such esteemed colleagues. And really the intention here is, in the next slide, to showcase what we know to be that industry and private commercial organizations do play this pivotal role in energy use, but also being able to incentivize and build towards a more effective built environment, a more efficient built environment, one which can take creativity in terms of different ways of trying and testing technologies and approaches. And that dialogue between industry and government is really critical towards achieving a net zero built environment. So I have a few slides to share, if we might show those, that will simply set out the context within which we're working, which is primarily one around achieving a net zero carbon built environment. And then secondly, to be able to highlight to you some of the approach towards the roadmaps before going to the panelists. I don't know if it's possible to see those slides, but when they appear, I'll be able to describe those. But in the meantime, something that's important to note is why buildings? And buildings are really critical towards a decarbonization plan of any country, and particularly looking towards the future, as we do in the ASEAN states, is that the growth of buildings to accommodate, growth in population and quality of life and living standards means that many of those emissions and buildings are being built now and will be built in the future. And it's up to 30% of our emissions that will be coming forward from buildings overall. And in this setting, we're also going to look at services that are not yet being consumed. So cooling in particular is a major issue. So last month, the IEA produced what is the net zero emissions report. And there, the net zero roadmap shows a pathway towards net zero for buildings and what that could look like. And so we know here in 2020, in terms of overall emissions being almost 3 gigatons of CO2, to give us a sense that's an enormous amount, and it's near the peak that it's ever been in modern times. But the anticipation of growth is where we need to start to manage down through efficiency and through better technologies around heating and cooling and the like for buildings. So charting a pathway, thank you very much. I'll just ask you to go to the 5th slide if you could. So if you chart a pathway towards net zero, we know that we need to instigate a series of mitigation measures around behaviors and avoided demands and a big chunk of that's going to be energy efficiency alongside electrification. Not sure if it's possible to skip forward to the slide 5, and that'll show at least an image of this pathway towards net zero by 2050. But really, the role of electrification and efficiency is going to account for 70% of that emissions reduction, which means renewables being a part of the power generation mix is really critical, especially as fossil fuels are phased out, but then efficiency for buildings being really core to that. So what is it that you need to get to net zero buildings? Well, energy intensity has to improve year on year towards a point where ultimately getting to, thank you very much for keep going to that was one slide just to show the audience, and you'll get a copy of these slides, so please, and I don't want to delay the panelists, but if we go to the next slide as well. To share the share of existing buildings that are net zero, and these are global numbers just to give you a reference point. This isn't just for the ASEAN, but implies overall this phase towards net zero ready buildings. What does that mean? It means that they need to be designed so that they can accommodate greater proportions of energy from renewables, but also that the buildings are designed such that to reduce first the demands that would otherwise be needed for cooling, for lighting, being able to have alternative fuels available for cooking and the like. So these are the sorts of things which in this slide are outlined towards that net zero pathway. So these the IEA recognize as being incredibly ambitious and yet necessary to get us towards that track. And in a context such as ASEAN, it is really vital that the future being built today will have this in mind as it's going forward. So in the next slide, I just want to highlight to you an opportunity for all of you to contribute to this process around building the roadmaps of sustainable buildings and construction through now to 2050. And what's really important here is that it builds on an existing roadmap that was set out for the region overall. It was beyond ASEAN, it included across the region, which had a set of targets identified as being important towards that pathway. But what this new ASEAN roadmap will do is build strategies. It looks at those enabling actions. And so it's really critical for us to get your input in order to understand how it is that those strategies could best be built to deliver this. And in the next slide, it gives you a quick outline of how this might work. And so across these 7 themes that we have as a part of the roadmap construction, we have a series of action areas against each one. So we want to directly speak to those whom are in industry, are in government, are working in the knowledge sector around education and training. And each will have a role to play. And that's what we want the roadmap to do, is to bring that forward. And in the next slide, of course, you can't read all the details here, but the idea being that that target audience has an explicit set of actions that they will be able to undertake and facilitate. And in the next slide, we have an illustration of what each of these tables and procedures will look like. It's obviously very messy, but there's a current status, there's an action or strategy, and by what dates should we anticipate these things to come together, that necessary ingredients to create the situation for a net zero carbon building. So lastly, I'll say in the next slide, there's an opportunity for yourselves to contribute to this. We have a survey which will be shared with you following this webinar for you to input your understanding of the context and your expectations around the strategies, and that will be incredibly informative to us to build this picture together. And then the last slide before I hand over to our panelist, first panelist, to say the next steps is that we're at a really critical phase in the roadmap building process, which is that this is where we're revising that second round of the draft. And we would really appreciate your input now and as we go into August as well. So we've hit the right moment for you to be aware of this and for you to contribute. So on that note, I will stop speaking, but do my first job, which is to introduce our first speaker. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that we have Mr. Sultan Sahara from the Director General of Cipta Karya, the Ministry of Public Works and Public Housing in Indonesia. And so I would like to say thank you so much for joining, and the floor is yours. And I look forward to asking a question, if I may, afterwards, and then to join the panel discussion. Thank you very much to you. I believe we might be muted. Let's see.
I would like to introduce myself. My name is Sultan Chahra. I'm from Ministry of Public Work. First, let us give thanks. Why the building sector is important to impact global warming? Is much more corrected with increase in global average temperature. Maybe we have a policy of energy building in Indonesia. Next. Excuse me. How to? Okay. Next. Sorry. Why the building sector is important? Yeah. First, we know the global average temperature is around 1.6 degrees Celsius. Is average. This is increase of gas emission of recycled carbon, and we know why the building sector of a part being small entity, the city, because this is most important for us of human to be live. We live in building is 93.3% time a day. Human life is in building. Why the building sector is important in energy conservation? We know the architecture observer institution, the truth of the pitch architecture 2030.org revealed the building sector is contribute 39% of global carbon dioxide emission, far exceeding the industrial sector just 32%, and the transportation is 23% in others. And we know why the building sector is have big solution, because building, as we know, is part of the city. Along of this increase in the population and the acceleration of the urbanization process, we need the infrastructure and living facilities will also increase. So building fill the face of the city in the form of 5 functions, namely residential function building, religious function building, economic function building, socio-cultural function building, and special function building in Indonesia. It takes high discipline from stakeholders so that the 5 functions of this building can support of the face of the city, so that it remain beautiful and sustainable. Building play a big role in the carrying capacity of their environment. In sustainable development, one of the factor must be phase of the order of achieve sustainable development. Among others, it should pursue the demand for building and supporting infrastructure without damaging of the environment. And this is evident the concept of business sustainability, with the complex of the global need is opportunity for all parties to provide innovative solution through social, economic, and environmental approaches. Ladies and gentlemen, in Indonesia, the law of 20 of 2002 concerning building, we call UUBG, Undang-Undang Bangunan Gedung, in Article 3, mandated building arrangement aimed at the realizing building that are functional and according with building arrangement that are harmonious in harmony with their environment. This is the basic of the state of obligate to organize of sustainable building. The building law in the ideal pattern of spatial planning law, which aim to create a safe, comfortable, produce sustainable space, and this is in line with the sustainable urban development (SUD) locus at 4 level: building, neighborhood, district, and city, and the region. So the energy between the spatial planning law and the building law is more described in synergetic direction with a very complementary approach. The spatial planning takes the global approach to detail, while from a different pole, the building law takes a global approach to building detail, but with a synergetic goals, sustainable and green. Building with a part of a big problem can be a big solution to reducing global greenhouse gas emission. The global footprint network analyzes that the building effectiveness level from this is 41%. Yeah. Building performance on the contribution of reducing greenhouse gas emission in offset of the stage of building contraction, namely from the planning state, contraction, implementation, utilization, and demolition. Indonesia is also still consists in following of the Bali Action Plan arrangement in the third Conference of Parties (COP) of the United Nations Framework Convention in Climate Change. The government of Indonesia commitment at the G20 meeting in Pittsburgh committed to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 26% on this own, or it's maybe 41% if they receive international assistance by 2022, and from conditional without action plan business as usual. The establishment of a technical standard for green building in government regulation number 11 of 2021 is a structural concrete step to reduce greenhouse emission and according with what commitment. Yeah, something that we are distinctive of unique of the rating tools in Indonesia version of green building include number one, determination of the energy conservation target of 25% and the target of drinking or clean water conservation of 10% at the planning stage. The state is very detailed in quantifying its category and criteria for site management, energy use efficiency, water use efficiency, indoor air quality, environmentally friendly material, waste management, and wastewater management. Number two, the existence of rating tools for building demolition performance with expected to support the reduction of greenhouse gas emission by 26% with the criteria of environmental set restoration, effort, and demolition procedure. And we know the existence of the rating tool for community green resilient performance. We call X2M, H2M, hunian hijau masyarakat. Yeah, we call hunian hijau masyarakat. X2M is like the public campaign for community green residential performance, which is expected to be able to promote green building and green building belonging to the community, communicate, work together in the green public campaign, strengthen energy conservation and water conservation institution at the grassroots level significantly. Based on law of 28th of 2002 concerning buildings, the implementation of building in Indonesia consists of planning, implementation, utilization, preservation and demolition of building. At the end of the planning stage, a building approval, we call a PBG, persetujuan bangunan gedung. As we know, PBG is EMB, izin mendirikan bangunan. Ya. We call now is PBG, persetujuan bangunan gedung, is given at the end of the planning stage, building approval. So certification is PBG. PBG is quality control of building. After the completion of implementation period of the building, a function worthy certification. We call certificate layak fungsi, SLF. Process is held. SLF with quality assurance, process for building management. Yeah. The green building certificate process, synergetic with the building approval of functional eligibility certification process based on Article 7 of the Law Number 11 of 2020 concerning of job creation. Every building must meet the technical standard of the building. The authority to set a technical standard belonging to central government, building approval or PBG, and the certificate of functionality SLF are issued by the regional government based on the building management information system. We call SIMBG, Sistem Informasi Manajemen Bangunan Gedung. We can try in www.simbg.pu.go.id, which was built by the central government. The green building certificate is an advanced certification from PBG and SLF. So PBG, SLF, and the higher is BGH, bangunan gedung hijau, green building certification. The visibility of the building meet the standard aspect of document completeness and technical standard of the building. Technical standard based on government regulation number 16 of 2021 consists of design, planning standard, monitoring implementation standard, demolition standard, provision of the implementation, cultural conservation building, provision of the implementation of the special functional building, provision for the implementation of state building, and the provision for the implementation of green building. The implementation of green building, we call BGH, PGX, is carried out in energy with the implementation of building in SIMBG. So BGH synergy processes with SIMBG. The building implementation cycle start from the pre-application, continues with planning with the output of building approval. Implementation of construction with the output of the first function worthy certification SLF first, utilization with the output of the end functional worthy certification, and the end with the demolition state of output the technical plan for demolition of building, RTB. RTB is rencana teknis pembongkaran. Jadi RTB is technical plan for demolition building. Green building planning certificate is issued in conjunction with the PBG process in SIMBG. The green building construction implementation certification was issued in conjunction with the functional certification 1, SLF1 for the first time, and the green building utilization certification is issued in conjunction with the end functional eligibility certification process. We notified with SLFN. So SLF, the second, third, and the others. And the green building demolition certificate is issued in conjunction with demolition technical plan (RTB) process. So the difference between PGH mandatory and the PGH recommendation is in PGH mandatory. The serial PBG output process will be issued when the planning PGH has passed of assessment of the planning PGH performance appraisal. Meanwhile, in the PGH recommendation process, in the PGH process and the PGH process run parallel. This is
Mr. Sahari,
PGH.
I just wanted to interject for a moment and say this is incredibly helpful to understand the picture for Indonesia. And I was just curious if I might ask you a question before we wrap up and move to the next speaker, if that was an opportunity, which was if you had a particular message that you would want to give to the developers who are coming to to work and working in Indonesia around how they would best help you achieve these greenhouse gas emission goals, and in using this development process that you've outlined, if you might give a message to them, and we can take away as one of the key learnings around what is clearly a very comprehensive set of actions that the government have now put in place. So if you had a message for industry around their actions for development, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah. Excuse me.
That's quite all right. Perhaps what we might do is this is a point we could pick up together as a group in the plenary session. But I just want to say thank you very much for this incredibly comprehensive presentation and set of slides. And I wanted to thank you for those. Perhaps we might be able to also, just for the conscious of time, to be able to move towards also the next speaker as well. Okay. But if you had if you wanted to give a last statement before we were able to move to the next speaker, that would be welcome.
Oh yeah, I think the need for strong change. We need change to support from actor implementing energy conservation to jointly strengthen the green building institution in government agency and community, so that we can anticipate global warming and climate change carefully with a focus of energy conservation. Because in essence of the earth, we inhabited is not inherited from our ancestors, but it alone from our children. So our obligation to return it a state of green. Yeah, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that's a really powerful point to send to the next speakers, and then we can pick that up in the panel as well. That need to be able to develop and protect for the future for our children, and not to misuse the resources that we have. That's incredibly insightful. Thank you so much. So if I might then welcome our next speaker to join, and this is Mr. Zulkifli Zahari, who is coming from the ESCO Services, the ESCO Association of Energy Services Companies, and he'll provide a presentation on the regulations and the interactions between government and industry around energy services. And so if I might also then invite Mr. Zahari to turn your camera on and to unmute yourself, and then we can go to your set of slides. So thank you very much for joining us today as well. The floor is yours. Oh, we might still be muted, but I'll take care of that. And let's try that. Okay. How about now?
Can you hear me?
Very good. Thank you so much. We can hear you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. My given title is Building Energy Policy and case studies on how energy service companies can contribute to delivery of energy efficient buildings. Showcasing Malaysia, of course. I'm from Malaysia. Next slide, please. These are the key initiatives that was carried out by our government. When I say our government, they also mean that it's working together with the stakeholders in the private sector. The earliest program at national level was this MIIP, which is towards getting the industries to be more efficient. This was seen as a very successful project and is the birth of Escorts. It gave birth to Escorts because there is a program on Escorts development. Yeah. The next one, this is the only regulation that Malaysia has, which was enforced in 2008, which is the Efficient Management of Electrical Energy Regulation. And it is being regulated by our Energy Commission. We have currently an ongoing energy action plan with many aspects of energy efficiency being looked into. And consequent to that, we had a specific project on building sector energy efficiency, which ran between 2011 and 2016. Yeah. Next slide, please. So in order for us to have a strong integrated energy policy, we know policies must be accompanied by regulation, it must be accompanied by fiscal incentives, it must be also accompanied by an implementing agency. In the absence of all these three interactions tools, we at Malaysia cannot claim to have a strong integrated energy policy as yet. Yeah. Nevertheless, it's being addressed at present. And where our targets are concerned, we've got our targets under the nationally determined contributions of COP21, but specific targets for buildings has never been established. Even in our latest Malaysia plan, it's not been tabled as yet. And we have a building code called the MS 1525, which has been in existence since 2001 and has been reviewed a few times. And in order for building to be approved, you have to go through the Uniform Building Bylaw. And it is intended that this building code be adopted into the building bylaws. But unfortunately, only 4 out of 13 states have adopted this, even though there's a lot of effort to try and change that. Of course, we don't have a very specific regulation in place yet in order to address energy efficiency in the building sector. But again, that is being addressed. Our energy price is somewhat subsidized. So therefore, it does not provide enough incentives in terms of electricity tariffs to create a very conducive energy efficiency market as yet. And in the absence of laws, in the absence of dedicated agencies, we have no clear system to monitor and gather and analyze or even disseminate information where energy efficiency is concerned in buildings. Next, please. Next, please. And this is the MS 1525, the building code that I mentioned was in existence since 2001. The full name for it is Energy Efficiency and Use of Renewable Energy for Non-Residential Buildings. The latest edition is, of course, in 2019. Next, please. Next, please. So the purpose of this building code is, of course, to ensure that buildings constructed, operated, and maintained are done in such that it reduces the use of energy. In Malaysia, according to the latest edition, our benchmark, our baseline energy utilization in non-residential building is about 200 kilowatt hour per meter squared per year. It used to be much higher than that, but because of the technologies available, it has been lowered. Next, please. Next, please. And this tool also provides the criteria and minimum standards for energy efficiency and guidance to energy efficiency designs for engineers and for all the designers to refer to. Next, please. And it does not only look into active systems. It also emphasizes the requirement to look into passive design strategies, which is outlined in this building code. Other than that, you're looking into electric power distribution, lighting, air conditioning, building envelope control systems for energy management. Next, please. And it covers office, hotels, shopping complex, department stores, which are primarily the key commercial buildings of a city. Next, please. So I mentioned just now, other than the 3 states out of the 13 states that adopt this MS 525, but on the private sector, we have all these green building tools, and we have 3 green building tools in Malaysia. The first one is the Green Building Index. The second one, Green RE. The next one, MyCRES, which is actually government operated. Next, please. So Green Building Index is a tool that was developed by the architectural and the engineering fraternity of Malaysia. And as indicated in this diagram, 35% is provided for energy efficiency alone. Yeah, and in order to achieve points for energy efficiency, the starting level will be 150 kilowatt hour per meter squared per year. And if you want to score points, of course, you reduce it by 10 until you can achieve 80 or 90, which you can get 15 points. Next, please. Green RE. RE actually refers to real estates. So the developers who want to have their own energy rating tool. In this case, we can see that combined with passive and active, the total that you can achieve is 60 points for energy efficiency. Next, please. And MyCRES is specific to government. If you want to have your building rated free, you can use this tool. Yeah, and energy performance is 36% in this case. And as a matter of policy, any government building, a new government building that's been constructed and costing more than 50 million ringgit, which is somewhere around 12 million US dollars, must be rated by this agency, MyCRES, under an agency called CIDB. Okay, next, please. This is the only regulation that is enforced right now. It's called the EMIR. It's been, it had more than 10 years waiting before it got enacted in 2008. And that's how difficult it is to get regulations on energy efficiency in Malaysia. Next, please. So who are affected by this regulation? Those people, those facilities that has a utilization of more than 3 million kilowatt hour over a consecutive period of 6 months. They have to adhere to this or comply to this regulation. And those energy producers who also produce more than 3 million kilowatt hours over a period of 6 months are also affected by this regulation. The generations, they have to actually inform the regulator who are the ones who are using the amount of energy as predetermined. And for those who use the amount of energy, they will have to comply such as providing the energy policies, getting specific qualified registered energy on board, whether it's outsourced or internal, and provide their measures that they are carried out by the affected facilities. Next, please. And of course, this I took from Energy Commission's slide, which shows that actually the level of compliance to this regulation is still not as expected. Up to now, the compliance level is about 60%. The fact of the matter is there's still inadequate energy managers that is required by the law in order to serve the market. So capacity building is affecting the effectiveness of this regulation, and there's a lot of effort still required in order for us to ensure that this regulation is fully effective. Next, please. So this is the only project that focuses specifically on building sector in terms of energy efficiency. Next, please. So it is supposed to remove barriers or facilitate energy efficiency in building. And at the bottom there, we can see that there are 5 components of the project. The first being the institutional capacity building, because it is seen that if the implementers, if the people who approve buildings and who monitors the progress are not able to understand the issues in relation to energy efficiency, then it's very difficult to move forward. And of course, we have a policy and regulatory framework, which is the most vital, and a financing component, and of course the normal awareness and building demonstration projects that goes along with such a project. And it is relevant to both new and existing buildings. Next, please. So they had a target. They have set a target by 2025 in order to have energy saving in terms of gigawatt hour of more than 350,000 gigawatt hours, and of course reduction of carbon reduction by 2,000 over kilotons by 2025. Next, please. So the need for dedicated building sector energy efficiency regulation remains the main focus for MESCO to push with, and that to me is one of our main goal that we see in order to come up with a building policy. We need the dedicated implementing agency. If probably you need, if it is Energy Commission, you need to beef up the organization, because currently there's only 7 in the whole country. There's only 7 personnel looking into energy efficiency in Energy Commission, which is hardly adequate as compared to Thailand and so on. And we need the regulation to collect data for energy labeling, compliance of building energy intensity, building audits, reporting, and of course penalties for non-compliance. Next, please. The project gave birth to an EPC fund, which totals about 20 million ringgit, which is equivalent to about $50 million. But the fact remains that without a regulation in place, the take-up is still not as much as we hope to. Next, please. And of course, our Malaysian Industrial Development Authority, which provides for tax incentives, plays its part. For Escorts, we are provided with pioneer status, and for companies that incur capital expenditure for conservative energy projects, they are given ITAs over a 5-year period. Next, please. And they emphasize on the ITA criteria is towards chiller replacements and VSD pumps and motors for energy efficiency and for energy conservation. We have heat pump application, heat recovery, and cogeneration. Next, please. I won't go through this, but these are all the list of government demonstration projects through the BSIP, which includes a number of ministries, even the Public Work Department headquarters, and Prime Minister's office, and so on. Next, please. Okay, the column shows what are the measures being done throughout the project. Next, please. There's a question about how Escorts help towards delivering energy efficient buildings. I think this is something that's quite familiar to many. Carry on, please. Next.
Perhaps, Mr. Zahari, this could, if you have this as your final messaging, that would be greatly appreciated, because I think you've shown some incredibly interesting things here. So please do share.
Do you want me to continue?
If you could wrap up with your perhaps a final message towards the group.
I'm okay stopping there, because we're talking about facilities. But again, we can actually talk about this Escorts and so on during Q&A.
That would be wonderful, of course. Well, thank you so much for that. I was very struck by the slide you show, and particularly as you know, the following slides are just very quickly being wrapped up through here, but was on the importance of different activities that I imagine Energy Services Commission would have, which was around the savings associated with process and air conditioning, and then lighting and compressors, which really tells me a lot about the need, you know, for a group like yourselves and the members that you might be representing around the act of recommissioning the building. You know, the services that are there, and just being able to go back in and fine tune them. So I was just curious about what your thought was to that. You know, the importance of recommissioning.
Oh, well, I would say more than 80% of our buildings are relatively old, you know, and they are being run by a lot of old systems, old technology. So, and that is, and as we can see from the baseline that was set by our building code, which is 200 over, as against the green building, the disparity is huge. So therefore, there's a lot of opportunities and to use existing technologies in air conditioning and lighting in order to improve the efficiency towards the required targets. And in Malaysia, according to our definition, a building will be efficient if it reaches 136 kilowatt hour per meter squared per year.
Okay, well that's presumably a target that will increase and improve over time as well, and I think that's something.
It will be reviewed every 5 years at least, you know.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this presentation, and as you say, we'll pick up some more interesting points in conversation in the discussion. So thank you very much. We had a tight timeline, and so on that note, I'll move to invite our next speaker, Mr. Matthew Kai, who is a consultant in energy efficiency and low carbon developments, and to be able to invite you to speak around the issues of multi-stakeholders and aligning goals and aspirations, because I think this is a key that was both brought up in both of the previous two presentations around that need to be able to join, you know, government, industry, visioning together, and what that means in terms of, you know, capacity and the transition for an industry. So I will invite you now to turn on your camera, if it hasn't already occurred, and then if you might begin the process of your presentation. So thank you very much. maybe unmuted. So let's try that.
Oh,
there
yeah.
we go. Excellent.
Okay,
thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, IEA and ACE for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here with so many wonderful people. I have to say also, it's very nice to see so many faces without mask for a change. So yeah, hello from Yogyakarta in Indonesia, not so far from where Mr. Sultan is. And today, so I'm going to present about how can industry best support building policy development effort toward reaching LDC targets. So I will start with just a very quick presentation about myself. Just next slide, please. So yeah, my name is Matthew. People here call me Mamat because it's more local. So I'm like a mechanical engineer, and I've been working for like 8 years now in Indonesia. And I had the chance to have like, you know, like to see the two sides of the equation. So I worked within an ESCO for 4 years, building energy efficiency projects, so ESPC, IGA, audits in industries and commercial buildings. And for the past 4 years, I had the chance to be involved in policy reforms with different ministries, Ministry of Public Works and Social Housing, Sultan is part of it, Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Environment. So it's interesting because it allows you to better understand like what are the gaps, you know, between the two sides, and like really trying to find solution to improve policy reform. So I've just put here like a few pictures so you can kind of see what the life of like either an ESCO or like a policy reformer looks like. Yeah, just to give you a quick idea. Next slide, please. So I broke down my presentation into 5 parts. The first one is just to provide like a quick overview of the Indonesian building context. The second one is to, like Jan was saying just earlier, just emphasize on the fact that you need to have like a more holistic approach for building decarbonization. Like most often we just look at what's happening between the operational part of the building. So we just look at energy usage during operation, whereas actually carbon footprint is kind of wider than just looking at this. And then kind of 3 orientations that from past experience and ongoing work, I believe are strong orientation toward supporting better policy reform and better alignment of goals between industry and public sector. Next slide. So very quickly, just an overview of the Indonesian landscape, building landscape. So most of the population already live in the cities. So we have like urban exodus quite impressive and quite fast. By 2045, 70% of the population is already living in the cities. So that's where it's happening, and that's where the challenges are today. We're building so many new buildings without really policies to really control energy demand. So that's why we have so many challenges in terms of energy demand, energy supply, but also associated carbon emission. Is like in Indonesia, actually, there is quite room for improvement in terms of building performance, because if you benchmark it with other buildings in the ASEAN region, Indonesian buildings are actually quite low in terms of building performance. And how could we explain that? So there is few orientation once again. Electricity is still cheap compared to other countries. Construction market is also quite cheap compared to other markets. And also, like, you have so many policies with questionable impact and gaps in terms of implementation and development, which makes that the progress in terms of is still challenging and rather slow up to this day. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. My first point about approaching building and approaching like energy efficiency or energy conservation roadmap or decarbonization roadmap is like it's really important to understand like the ecosystem. So now we're talking about industries, we're talking about policymakers, but we have to understand who are all the key stakeholders revolving around this policymaker industry, because all of them take part into the decarbonization process. Another thing is you have all these stakeholders, but also you have all these building supply chain. Like I was saying earlier, ESCO normally focus on how do I'm going to reduce energy usage. So I'm going to improve either energy efficiency in system or reduce energy demand or work on the building envelope. Actually, if you look at the building supply chain, there is so many impactful solution orientation that you can provide, starting from material production until demolition. And I think it's important to have like this double understanding of what is my ecosystem and what is I'm talking about when I'm talking about buildings and decarbonization of building, because involving all the stakeholders is how you're going to be able to develop cross-sectorial and multi-ministries policies where you're going to have an engagement from all the parties and all the actors that are going to kind of own this transition and make it effective and make it happening. Next slide. So speaking of that, I'm going now to kind of try to explain an approach that we have been developing with the Global Buildings Performance Network, which is a policy reformer for Indonesia since last year, and which has this kind of a coalition approach with the purpose of many purposes, but one of the purposes is really to break those barriers between public and private sector and to create safe space to enable policy reform. So with the actual context, what does this kind of engagement with local actor looks like? Sometimes is a Zoom webinar, sometimes is a safe meeting with local stakeholders. Yeah, but once again, like the approach from an ESCO perspective, it's kind of different because in Indonesia, because of the law enforcement of regulation regarding energy conservation, that's not really something you can rely on, you know, to sell.
It's not necessarily a value proposition if it's not being scrutinized in that way. Thank you, Matthew. I think I heard the system go now saying it was back on. Let's join in the rest of the attendees, and please do carry on for another 5 minutes if you might, your presentation.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much.
Maybe
we very quickly skipped ahead.
Previous slides, I don't speak that fast. I can try, but that was a bit too much.
I think the one before slide was the
one after, please. Yeah, the one after. Yeah, the next one. The next one is a good one. All right. So as I was saying, like I think we are at the stage now that we've seen so many gaps in terms of policy development and also policy implementation. And what we've been observing here is like you have low compliance rates, and this is due to the fact that up until now there is just little communication and coordination between the public and private sector. So like everybody is running on his side. Industry are doing their thing, policymakers are doing their thing, and there is little coordination in terms of how do we understand like the current situation, status quo, and how do we build baseline, and how we define orientations that are going to be inserted into policies reform in terms of how do we move forward the building energy performance agenda. So what we've been trying to do is like really have this open communication and safe space between public entities and policymakers and industry, just to have this, I would say, like easy discussion about what are the gaps in terms of policy development and policy reform. And the objective of having this kind of discussion, like cross-sectorial discussion, in the first one, to have a better comprehension of the challenges from each side, because in terms of policy implementation, you also have challenges from the public sector, to have a greater ownership among public authorities. They understand like why they need to do this public policies leading to decarbonization of the built environment, how to do it and what to do, but also from the industries and private sector to have an adoption of this new regulation, new mandatory requirements. And this leads to actually better comprehending the challenges, but also the opportunities. And also we've seen that it's leading to a better adoption from the private sector of this new regulation and mandatory requirements and higher compliance rates. So that's one big orientation, like enabling this coordination to improve policy development and reduce implementation gap. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the second slide is just to emphasize on the fact that we're talking about, you know, this transition toward a low carbon built environment, and we are thinking about fancy technologies that we believe are far away from us in the future. Actually, there is so many best practices already there today, but it's just like by a minority of industries. You know, like we can call it champion. I just name like many others, but these champions, they go beyond regulation and go beyond monetary development, just not because they have to do it, but it can be because of the company DNA, can be because of quota, can be because of targets. So they have these best practices. The thing is, these best practices is not yet socialized. So you have the other industries that sometimes are in non-compliant situation, I would say politely. They need to be provided this kind of information to just try to fill the gap in terms of capacity, technology, expertise. So you need to have a certain alignment with, you have your industry field, you have your private sector field, and then you have best practices, and you need to have like an alignment so the sector can grow together, and also so the public policies can be improved and reformed based on these practices that are already market ready. So the second big idea here is like, once again, by having this coordination and communication between public-private sector and better association of best practices, you have opportunities to fast forward policy reform and to prioritize actions that actually are proven solution. Like I was talking earlier with Jan, is like not something like no one has seen before. It's something that have been proven, that is market ready, and that is feasible and implementable. Next slide, please. I think that would be my last slide. I think this one is about, you know, strength in number. It's like it's a bit cliche, but as I was saying before, you know, like you have best practices already there. People like who are already doing their part of the job, but now we need to leverage and we need to upscale. Like we know how to make one low carbon houses, you know, how to make one low carbon process. So the thing we are struggling now is, how do we upscale this? How do we replicate in a country like Indonesia with 260 million inhabitants? So the idea here is like to create coalition of champions that allow a certain alignment in terms of goals, in terms of knowledge, awareness, like I was saying earlier, also in terms of language. So they know they're talking the same language, they do the same thing, and in terms of targets as well. And this is actually going to push forward and to accelerate the transition, because you're going to have like a movement of people trying to initiate this low carbon transition. So coalition, either from purely public, private, or purely private sector entities, are one of the big orientation to be considered to fast forward the low carbon agenda. And actually, things like this already happened. Like in Indonesia, you have a coalition of cement industry, coalition of developers. So it's already here. Actually, it's like something already proven. What we need to do is just to enable it, to make it even faster, even more impactful. And I think that's pretty much for me. I would just finish on saying that I think we need to really realize the fact that the transition needs to happen way faster than how it is happening right now. And for that, we need to really break this barrier between policymakers and industries and all other stakeholders along the building supply chain. And for doing that, we need to enable coordination, better communication, and better understanding of the challenges and the gap for us to be able to fill it. Thank you very much, everybody. The next slide is just if you want to contribute to GVP and Action in Indonesia, you can visit our website or social media. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. This is really great, and I think it's a unique but probably a much needed point to bring across in this conversation that we've had so far. In that the ambition around building those collaborations, the diagonal collaborations or coalitions, in the sense of having industry and government working together, and to avoid the mismanagement of expectations, but also to build on what we know to be kind of skills and knowledge and creativity that exist out there, to showcase that in a much more programmatic way. So this is a really great initiative that you shared with us today. So thank you very much, and we'll hopefully have a little bit of time to unpack that in a panel discussion as well, because I've got some interesting questions that I think you'd be interested to answer. So on that note, thank you very much. And if we can then invite our next speaker, Mr. Christopher Seeley. And my hope is that you're with us after the slight disruptions. But just to say welcome, and you're going to join us and speak about energy efficiency potential with ESCOs in Thailand, and some of the challenges that you face in the sizing of the opportunity of the company that may be there to bring in. So thank you very much for joining, and I will hand over to you and your slides for the next 10 minutes or so. Thanks so much.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much as well. My presentation is altogether only 11 slides, so I'll be quick, and then we can get into more of a perhaps meaningful discussion around energy efficiency in buildings and ESCOs. Just might start out with outlining a bit about my company. If we can go to the next slide, please. Yep. Generally, we were set up in 2010 and are a comprehensive ESCO operating in Thailand. This is inclusive of both energy efficiency and renewable energy services or solutions. And we offer the traditional ESCO delivery models, most of which are based upon either guaranteed performance contracts or guaranteed savings contracts, and then a bit on the shared savings model, and then the other end of the spectrum, which we call energy purchase agreements. Others would call the chauffage model, which focuses on the production and sale of various different utilities or energies, such as electricity, chilled water, hot water, steam, etc. And with those models, of course, comes the different payment structures or financing models. Next slide, please. This generally gives you an idea of the various different technologies and solutions, which I think are very key to achieving anywhere close to the net zero buildings we're talking about, or other panelists have spoken about. A lot of it is going to have to come from the HVAC side of things, air conditioning through various different types of high efficiency chillers, and then the heat pumps, hot water systems. For the industrial side of things, cogeneration, trigeneration, waste heat recovery, the use of new technologies and more natural refrigerants, such as heat pumps being run on CO2 as an extremely natural refrigerant. And then the smaller components, which all contribute to the overall larger opportunity to reduce energy consumption in a building or facility, which are the lighting, the ventilation systems, putting everything together into building energy management system, and then lastly, incorporating a component of renewable energy, which in Thailand right now is mostly solar rooftops. So what we do is kind of put all of these together into ESCO projects here in Thailand. Been doing that for the past 10 years. Next slide, please. I've just taken a couple of examples from some projects, hotels and resort sector, just to share with everyone an idea of some of the projects. Thailand, like Indonesia, like the Philippines, and to a certain extent Malaysia, we've got a lot of buildings or hospitality services buildings. So I took a couple of examples from some projects we've been working on. Here's a simple 4-star resort about an hour and a half outside of Bangkok, where we looked at the comprehensive energy consumption of a building of this resort, replaced all of their lights with new LEDs, put in a new high efficiency oil-free magnetic bearing chiller, put in a new water-to-water heat pump system, which is integrated into the chiller system, and then lastly incorporated a solar rooftop component to kind of balance out, and achieved about a 35% projected energy cost savings for them. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another resort application on an island out in Samui in Thailand here. Similar types of solutions focusing on air conditioning, hot water, lighting, and building energy management system. Investment was roughly about $1 million, and this was done on a guaranteed performance contract over a term of 7 years. So just a couple of hands-on real-life examples of projects we're doing here, and those which I believe are very replicable across the ASEAN region. Next slide, please. The next few slides are just some background information on what's going on in Thailand. I think we all know, not only in Thailand, but in the region, if we look at buildings, first of all, they're continuously increasing in consumption. In Thailand, they've separated out the data between shopping malls and retail representing smaller department stores and shops, shopping malls reflecting the bigger, larger encompassing shopping centers, and then hotels and commercial office. The only key takeaway from this slide is really that none of these building types are going down in terms of energy consumption. Overall, with increased development, increased building, urbanization, etc., we're certainly going to see an increase in electricity consumption from these from the commercial building sector. Next slide, please. And then this is taken from a portfolio of various different energy efficiency retrofit case studies, all delivered by using an ESCO model, either performance guarantee, shared savings type model. And you can see that in general, each building type, still focusing a bit on the commercial side of things, energy consumption achieved or energy reduction achieved is somewhere between 15 to 18, 19% on average. That's the opportunity for the energy and greenhouse gas emission reduction. And all of them fall within a payback period of less than 5 years, which still remains attractive to most business decisions in these building types. Next slide, please. This drills down a bit more into the technologies and energy conservation measures for this portfolio of case studies. Once again, the investment and the total savings achieved are coming from the air conditioning systems or HVAC. And then as you break the other solutions down a bit further, they're very specific to the individual building use. In offices, it's always going to be air conditioning and lighting. And then if you look at hotels, for example, there's a component there of hot water, which is a second largest consumer of energy in these building types, and it can offer about a 25% reduction or contribution to the overall reduction that we saw on the previous slide. So this kind of just lays out the opportunity to reduce energy consumption in the different areas and the associated investment required per category. Next slide, please. Sorry. And then this I think this is an interesting platform for a discussion in terms of, if we look at the commercial building sector in Bangkok alone, being the capital city with the most commercial buildings in the country. Across the board, if we include office space, retail space, and 4- and 5-star hotel space in Bangkok, we've got about 30 million square meters of space. And if we assign the energy reduction potential to each one of those building types, that comes up with about a required investment, or what I'd like to term as the investment opportunity of just over $400 million for Bangkok alone in these 3 building types, which are likely to deliver about $123 million worth of energy cost savings per year. Then if we look further in detail towards the CO2 emission, or the greenhouse gas emission reduction, that's about 618 tons of CO2 reduced per year, all generating a payback for the investment of just under 3.5 years. So all pretty positive numbers there from looking at Bangkok as an example of retrofitting the commercial building space. Next slide, please. And then a couple of key points which I'd like to share with the panelists especially, but I think we've got to maintain our focus on a single objective when we're talking about ESCOs and energy efficiency in buildings, etc. It's really to look at reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, no matter what policies are involved, or whether they're part of NDCs or targets or regulation. It's really about focusing on increasing or reducing greenhouse gas emissions from existing buildings. But I think one of the most important parts of that objective should be to get the private sector much more involved, whether that's the participation of building owners that own portfolios of properties across a country or across the region, even getting commitments from them to achieve a certain reduction in energy consumption and hence emissions. And then, of course, the financing side of things. Three key stakeholders in Thailand, for example. I'd say the SME market has the highest potential in terms of the fact that they represent about 50% of total electricity consumption, which is relatively high compared to other SME sectors in the region. One of the limitations of a lot of government policy so far over the past 10 years in Thailand has been that a lot of them have been developed and focused on the largest buildings and factories, very high energy consumers, but they've left the SMEs behind somewhat. And these SMEs are the ones who really benefit from the ESCO model. I mean, the major buildings and factories don't really need the ESCO services as much as SMEs. And then the other two, getting the banks and financial institutions involved in providing financing, not relying so much on government subsidy, grant, or financing programs. And then saying that, yes, the ESCO model is actually a model of preference, especially for this target group of SMEs, in terms of all of this: guaranteed savings, shared savings, leasing models, and the energy purchase agreement model. One last slide. Next slide, please, and I'll finish off in. Yeah, so this is what I'd say. If we as industry leaders look towards, we should look at encouraging or developing initiatives, policies, partnerships that will deliver greater participation by private financial institutions in each of our countries in the region, including regional banks, VCs, private equity, fintech. Try and figure out a way to get them involved. To develop risk-sharing facilities, whether semi-government or third-party development agency, development bank, grant funds, etc. And then lastly, to figure out a way to support investments required into investment-grade audits, because that's one of a small little barrier in the market, but I think has the potential to generate a lot of the bankable projects which will attract the financing the whole industry. So I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Christopher. I think that you've highlighted a really interesting, I'd say, perspective, being able to speak to those where, you know, talking about SMEs in particular, the limitations they may have around accessing, you know, financing or the choice of technologies. And I was going to ask you one quick follow-up question, and then I'll invite the group to come on, which is just in your experience, what are the key concerns around the different risks or that an SME might have in engaging in different contracts that you could offer? You know, what do they see there as being a key concern that you need to break down the barrier for? Is there something in particular that comes out, you know, as a common issue, or is it just dependent on their own circumstances?
I think on the onset of these projects, most of them are concerned about the investment. The initial investment required to do whatever you want to propose them to do. I think their biggest concern is it's gonna be good. We'll be able to save energy. We'll be able to save money, but how are we going to be able to afford it? Where are we going to get the money to do this? So that's kind of the first barrier from a lot of SMEs that know they could be running at a much more efficient level. They could reduce a lot of their energy costs, but how do they come up with the initial investment required to get there in the first place?
Right. Well, thanks very much, Christopher. I think that's an important point which we can maybe bring on with the other panelists as well. I've just messaged to the entire group, but it was meant for the panel members to please join back to the session with cameras and be unmuted, because I wanted to go over a couple of questions if we have time for the group, to be able to kind of highlight some of this experience around how it is that industry is reacting and being a force of driving change as well. You know, one of the questions I had was around regulation of markets, you know, of where in different countries the experience is as being the most, say, effective towards achieving that change. So maybe if I might start with you, Mr. Zahari, what do you see in Malaysia as being some of the most effective regulations that could achieve that change that you've been talking about for building performance in Malaysia?
First and foremost, I think I've clarified just now that we really do not have a very specific regulation on buildings as yet. But in my opinion, if we were to have a regulation that we want it to be effective, then the first thing we have to do is to specify the building energy intensity of the various categories of buildings that we have into a regulation. Yeah? And in order for it to proceed on a more comprehensive basis, then we can even adopt criteria on green building criteria, which also assists the building to look into passive in more detail, and that also will help. And of course, when you have a tool, rating tool, then we will also be looking into renewable energy to be incorporated into the buildings. Yeah, and looking far ahead into the future, perhaps even there will be some liberalization of the energy supply market, where the buildings can even acquire energy from the large solar farms in order to achieve net zero as we progress and evolve into a more advanced energy market scenario. And of course, you need to have mandatory submissions as well for regulations to be effective. So that is what I will propose to the government. And just for your information, our government, we are working with the government to come up with an energy efficiency act, of which hopefully it will also have a sub-regulation on buildings as well. But it's already quite you know, it is 5 years behind time because of well, our political
many reasons. Yes. Well,
okay.
thank you very much for that. Mr. Sahara, as you joined as well, I was curious again, in your experience in Indonesia, you know, particularly working in the Ministry of Public Works and Public Housing, you know, the role that regulation has to play in industry. I wanted to ask you a specific question, which was, often a government has an objective to achieve something, and do you find that if you were to engage industry, and I expect you do, in the way of consulting with them, are they more ambitious, or do they often sit and say, you know, you're asking too much? And if so, how do you as a ministry kind of react to that to ensure that they can work with you to achieve your goals? What would be the things that you would advise?
Yeah, I think the Indonesia so make sure with the rating tool. In this case, maybe we can describe about green building information assessment from in Indonesia. We have a logo with Garuda. Garuda is a symbol of the highest performance. One is performance assessment in issue of legal seat. Yeah. Number two, this performance assessment consists 16 performance assessment with 6 performance assessment for buildings, 10 performance assessment for community green area shelter. The third, there are we built 165 points in each of what assessment in each state, and in this case, we have a 3 rating in 2 mandatory and recommended category. I think this.
Right, and having that dichotomy of mandatory and voluntary, I suppose, offers the opportunity for those who'd like to achieve a greater rate of change, you know, to commit to greater. That's really informative. Matthew, this is a point that I wanted to ask to you as well. In that building of coalitions, there's going to be different speeds, and this is something which, you know, you're saying about best practice and the like. How it is that you're able to showcase, or do you find in the engagement you've had and the conversations you've had, those who want to express how they're going to do more quickly can transfer that knowledge and that experience to those whom may be a little bit hesitant, maybe don't yet have the experience. So I'm just curious if you could reflect on that approach and what you found to be most effective in knowledge sharing between industry.
Yeah, so I think, like, you know, like industries, they're always like eager to show, you know, how good they are performing. So I think it's not really a matter of for them to want to demonstrate their best practice. They want to do it. Like the question, like you say, is like, how do you ensure an alignment where you have different speed, different resources, different expertise, and like that's where like you have a kind of capacity building processes that come into it. But also actually what we've seen is like you have a need for capacity building, you have a need for knowledge sharing, best practice sharing, but actually what is even more important is how do you sustain this knowledge management and knowledge transfer? Because what we've seen is either within the public entity or private sector, you have so many turnovers. So like even sometimes you have like knowledge transfer, best practice transfer, and like it's been there for few time, like you have training and things like this happening, but then after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, it disappears. So how do you sustain this knowledge transfer, and how do you align this, I would say, motivation from different stakeholders? And once again, it's by demonstrating that from a private entity, what they want to know is it interesting from a market perspective, not in terms of regulation and policies alignment, but is it going to make my business better? I'm going to save energy and costs. That's just what I want to do. So once again, is depending on which stakeholder you're going to engage with, you need to comprehend what is their target, what is their objectives. Like, for example, if we're engaging with the Ministry of Public Works and Social Housing, they have a different perspective from the developers or the Association of Architects or the industries of building materials. So once again, is understanding each target, each objective of these different key stakeholders, and trying to find how to best promote each best practice, knowledge, and capacity.
Great, thank you, Matthew. And that raises an interesting question, which actually comes from the audience as well, that I can direct to Christopher, and then maybe somebody else would care to comment on, which is really around the specifics around, say, contracting and experience with contracting, because I think you mentioned, both of you, this idea of risk and risk sharing, and then also the association with the financing of this. And I'm just curious if we had one question which is around in terms of performance guarantee, and how you would advise to reduce risk, and again, that experience, which tells you a lot about whether a risk is large or in fact small, and just what measures you've Christopher, sought to try and emphasize in developing those types of contracts, perhaps also with SMEs in mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we haven't faced the view or the worry from customers on the risk side of things, whether whether the performance is not going to hold up. But the other side is in accessing finance. The financial institutions see us as extremely high risk. So how do we develop something there to overcome that barrier to ESCOs being able to access financing? The risk on the side, or the concern from the customer's side on whether the ESCO is going to be able to fulfill that which is guaranteed in the contract isn't that much of a big issue in Thailand right now, I find. It's still there, but
right,
through the use of standard energy performance contracts, through third-party consultants, through technical assistance provided from various different programs under the government, etc. I think that's become lessened.
Okay, so there's mechanisms that are built around that to affect that. Perhaps maybe Matthew, I think you had a comment, and then maybe I could ask the others of a similar nature. Probably also respond on the financing side, because I think that's quite an interesting challenge. So Matthew, perhaps you could comment on that, and then Mr. Zahari and Mr. Sahara to comment on the financing.
Yeah, just like really quickly, but I actually agree with Christopher, and I think like that's where you have like a disconnect right now, because higher performance building in theory just bring lower risk, lower investment risk. So why do we struggle still today to fund ESPC, for example? Right, so exactly like a big disconnect. And I think once again, it's a question of, it's not yet common practice to have energy saving performance contracting being developed and implemented, I would say, in Indonesia. So financing body just don't trust it, even though in theory you have like a lower investment risk there, but because they have not seen like a proven process here, are they going to engage in this process because they are the first one, and like they're always like, okay, the first one, I'm not really sure about it. So in theory, like it should bring a lower investment risk, but in practice, because there is not such demonstration project yet, it's difficult to just run it, and that's where like financing is struggling to be secure for this kind of project, I would say.
Right, they haven't yet caught up to the notion, which is something of being able to put their money where they often express it. So Mr. Zahari, I was just curious about, again, your experience here is, do you see that concern around the financing and access to financing among the association that you speak with and your members, and what have you shown to be effective to try and help reduce that barrier, or address that barrier of access to capital to achieve this sort of change?
Well, first and foremost, I agree with Chris that we are not worried about the technicalities of the installation, because and even the clients know what works and what doesn't work. I mean, they've got their technical team as well, and it's all proven technology. But then it's a question of whether whether it is being funded through a guaranteed kind of a scheme or whether it's a shared saving kind of a scheme. Yeah, and I have presented in my slides just now that through a certain arrangement of a government-owned bank, we have the funds available. 200 million ringgit, which is equivalent to $500,000 for a start. Our problem maybe is not funding, but to get the dues. So that's Malaysia's because without the stick, sometimes people just don't bother about wanting to save energy. After all, they're still surviving. Yeah, so I think our problem, I don't know whether it is unique to us, but if you do not have the stick, whilst you have all these incentives in place, people do not care about wanting to save very much. So it is something that I always say that we still need a little bit of the stick and a balance of things in order to move forward. Funding, I think, despite the shortfalls of many of banks not understanding how to manage the risk, but funding is still available in Malaysia.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting to note, the classic, 10% of any regulation, people will actively try and get out of it. And the 5% they need to know get caught. So that incentivizes everybody else to make sure that they do it. Mr. Sahara, I was just curious from your perspective. We've talked a little bit about the financing and the technologies, but one which I think mentioned in your own talk, which was around different fuels and the way in which you can make use of local resources in some of the opportunities around achieving efficiency. So being able to consider alternative fuels as a part of that mix. So I'm just curious about how you, in devising flexibility to industry to be creative towards whether that's a different fuel or a different technology, do your regulations, as you have in the voluntary, do they accommodate that type of flexibility? Are you able to accommodate creativity in the market when they come up with new products and new ideas to implement?
Okay. I think we have of criteria in our green building assessment with the building sheet and had accumulated overall thermal transfer value, and this Indonesia have almost 35 watts per meter square. This is a technical standard in our regulation. Energy use efficiency, we make regulation in building sheet, ventilation system, air conditioning system, and lighting system, and in-house transportation system. I think this sub criteria can make use our
provide that opportunity.
Okay. Yeah.
That's really great. I have one other question for you, which comes from the audience, which is around the rating standard in terms of their stringency. Which is more stringent, which is harder in terms of it, more better at achieving energy efficiency, between GBCI rating or the PUPR rating? Do you have a view as to which is more, stringent, which is more able to achieve the goal of improving efficiency?
Yeah, I think it's little more our regulation in undang-undang with job creation law amended we to use our criteria. So PUPR, Minister of PUPR can make the green building criteria with Permen PUPR number 21 in this year. This is more little bit the same with I think this.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to wrap up because I know we're over time, but we had a few technical difficulties. But maybe if I could ask you each for one reaction to this next question, and I was curious about, how best do you believe that these types of best practice findings can be communicated to government and to industry? Would a database, would a coalition of best practice guides, what's the best approach to be able to get this information that you're describing so that more people are aware of it in industry and can take action? So perhaps, Christopher, I could start with you. What's the thing that you think needs to happen to better communicate what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think all of the platforms always help. If there's some kind of a center of excellence hosted by the national ministry relating to energy efficiency, etc. I think if it's a group effort whereby a set of basic documents are put forward as a repository somewhere that everyone can access and all the key leaders kind of put a rubber stamp on, I think that's great. In Thailand, we've had a lot of efforts done on standardizing an energy performance contract so that building owners can actually go to the Ministry of Energy website and download a standard energy performance contract which represents best practices, international standards, etc. And we believe is a fair deal for both the building owner and the ESCO. So I think anytime you can put together a set of documents which are respected in the market by everyone, I think that's a good start.
Thank you, Christopher. Mr. Zahari, your view on best ways to communicate, these types of things, whether that's standards or best practices or the like, if you have a quick reaction to that.
Well, I think Chris did give answer to what I am thinking we should communicate. The first thing the public should know is if we don't do these things, the pandemic is nothing. It's going to affect everybody in the worst way. We can see what's happening to China and America and so on. And that's the first thing that we have to realize, that our grandchildren is going to blame us if we all don't do our part, whether we're a household, whether we're and that is the first thing we have to communicate. The need, the purpose for energy efficiency. And then we have to inform the industries what are the technologies available, what are the technologies that they can do in order to improve their efficiencies. And of course, for residents to know what are the equipment that they can use in order to improve their living standards at home while saving energy. And of course, the other tools, the other business models, is just a question of making it aware in the main media, so that people are more conscious.
Thank you for that. And may I also ask the same question about best way to communicate to you, Mr. Sahara, before I go to Matthew, and then we'll close up. So what in your experience in Indonesia would be a really effective way of communicating these types of best practices to industry?
I think know each other, communicated with each other, we will be strong to make our earth green again. I think that.
These types of forums, that's really great. Thank you for that. And Matthew, just any last given and coalitions in terms of how you might communicate best effectively across them.
I was muted, but I really resonate with what Christopher was saying. I think we need to build like some knowledge management platform with ownership within certain ministries or key policymaker, and like to have also the market recognition, because once again is how do we sustainably build capacity and align expertise among all these stakeholders. So having this, I don't know, center of excellence or platform where people can just pick resources, can be guidelines, can be tips, can be whatever, just for them to be able to see what is out there in terms of best practices and to see how they can try to align and try to build their own capacity to make sure that they're also able to participate into this transition. So yeah, I would say knowledge management platforms and cross-sectorial center of excellence with ownership and with market recognition.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining this today and for being able to share your presentations and your views on this topic. From my personal thanks to you, and also the accommodating of the slight disruption we had. But now I'll turn over to Kianda to close out the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamilton, and all our speakers for the really insightful and interactive sessions. I would also like to apologize for the slight technical disruption that we had during the webinar. Hopefully, the webinar is still really useful for all of you. And ladies and gentlemen, since we are entering the final stages of the webinar, please join me in welcoming Mr. Indra Wahyudin from the ASEAN Secretariat to deliver the closing remarks. Mr. Indra Wahyudin, the time is yours.
Thank you, Kianda. I will not make long closing remarks today. Good afternoon, distinguished delegates and participants. The ASEAN Secretariat, together with the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and also ACE, ASEAN Center for Energy, would like to thank for the moderator today, Dr. Ian Hamilton, and also the panelists, Pak Sultan Sahara, Mr. Zulkifli Zahari, Mr. Matthew Kale, and Mr. Christopher Seeley, for the excellent presentations and for giving an interesting and informative discussion on the role of industry in buildings policy development. The insight from today's discussion serve as valuable inputs to the development of ASEAN roadmaps on energy efficiency, buildings and construction and sustainable cooling that we are working now. We also would like to thank the support given by AEDCP2, the ASEAN-Australia Development Cooperation Program Phase 2, for this undertaking. Lastly, we would like to thank all the participants for joining us in this webinar. This is the fourth webinar that we have for the webinar series. We already have 2 webinars on cooling topics and 2 webinars on building topics. We hope that participants could get the insightful knowledge today from discussion and could participate in the upcoming events. We are pleased to note the discussion on how the building sector can help support ASEAN's in immediate and long-term energy goals by improving energy efficiency to reduce the energy intensity and supporting the adoption of distributed low-carbon and renewable energy generation. Today's webinar has provided excellent opportunity to engage industry and business stakeholders in driving forward the application of efficient, resilient, and low-emission buildings. The private sector's cooperations and commitment in adapting climate-resilient business models and advocating the use of energy-efficient technologies in business operations is essential in bringing about positive impact towards developing a sustainable energy future. It has been a very fruitful gathering today. Once again, thank you very much for everyone's participation, and may you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Back to you, Kianda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Indra Wahyudin, for the closing remarks. And can we go to the next slide, please? Ladies and gentlemen, before ending our webinar today, I would like to kindly ask for your cooperation in filling up our survey for the development of the buildings and cooling roadmaps, which approximately will take around 15 minutes to complete. A link to the survey is accessible via email, will be sent after the event. Finally, on behalf of the organizers, the ASEAN Center for Energy, the ASEAN Secretariat, the International Energy Agency, and also the ASEAN-Australia Development Cooperation Program Phase 2, I would like to thank everyone for making time to join us at today's webinar, and I wish everyone a pleasant day. Stay healthy and stay safe. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much.